Welcome. You've arrived at another quiet journey into the past, where history unfolds not in sudden bursts of noise or drama, but in slow, measured ripples, like gentle waves along a quiet shore. Tonight, we will wander back into the mid-16th century, to a time of upheaval, faith, ambition, and fleeting power. We will follow the life of a young girl, who, through circumstance, education, and the machinations of those around her, rose to the highest station in England, yet only for 9 days. A girl who wore the crown, and who would not live past the tender age of 20. This is the story of Lady Jane Grey, often remembered as the 9 Days Queen. As always, we will not rush. We will linger on the textures of daily life, the rhythm of existence in Tudor England, and the quiet details of her world. Imagine yourself not as an observer of grand battles or dramatic declarations, but as a traveler slipping unnoticed into kitchens, libraries, gardens, and private chambers, watching life unfold as it once did. Let us begin, then, not with the crown or the scaffold, but with the ordinary days of the 16th century, the backdrop against which Jane's brief and luminous life unfolded. Imagine yourself in the England of the 1530s, the decade of Lady Jane Grey's birth. The air carries the scent of hearth fires, mixed with the damp freshness of fields and gardens. Villages and towns stretch across rolling green countryside, punctuated by the occasional rising tower of a church or castle. Life begins early here. Before dawn, the first stirrings of the household echo through wooden halls. Servants shuffle about, coaxing flames back to life from embers that had glowed quietly through the night. The soft crackle of kindling, the muted thud of footsteps across rush-strewn floors, and the faint smell of smoke begin the day. For a noble child like Jane, the morning would come differently than for a peasant's daughter. While the village children might already be helping their parents tend animals or fetch water, Jane would be gently roused in her chamber. Her room, though grand by comparison to a cottage, was still cold in winter, the thick stone walls holding in the chill. Heavy curtains drawn across her bed helped keep warmth close. She might hear the rustle of her nurse's skirts before feeling the layered fabrics of a gown drawn over her shoulders. The day for her was filled with learning. Unlike most girls of her time, who might only be taught to manage a household, Jane's education was unusually rigorous. Tutors, well-versed in Latin, Greek, and even theology, were brought to her side. Imagine her, a small figure at a large wooden table, tracing unfamiliar letters onto parchment, her breath slow and steady in concentration, the scratch of quill against paper the main sound in the quiet room. Outside, the life of the manor pulsed steadily. The kitchens were alive with clattering pots, chopping herbs, and the warm aroma of bread baking in great ovens. Servants moved about with a rhythm that was constant, almost timeless, fetching water from wells, carrying firewood, tending to the gardens and stables. In the great hall, tapestries hung heavily on the walls, woven scenes of hunting and legend that softened the echoes of footsteps. The rushes strewn across the floor were changed frequently, scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary, masking the odors of daily living. Dogs wandered in and out freely, curling themselves near the fire. Food was plentiful for Jane's family. Meals might include roasted meats, fresh fish, spiced pies, and bowls of fruit preserved in honey. For a young child, however, the ritual of meals was also about manners, learning to sit still, to speak little, and to watch her elders closely. Dining was a lesson in discipline as much as sustenance. Beyond the manor walls, the ordinary people of Tudor England lived differently. Their cottages were small, smoky, and warm with life pressed close together. Meals were simpler: bread, pottage made of grains and vegetables, perhaps a bit of cheese or ale. Their days revolved around the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, and enduring the long nights of winter. As Jane grew, she would have been aware of both worlds, the noble estate and the peasant village nearby. Imagine her glancing from a window, watching children chase one another in muddy lanes, their laughter mingling with the calls of livestock. A different rhythm, yet part of the same country, the same moment in history. Education, piety, and discipline filled her days. She read scripture, studied languages, and absorbed the weight of expectation that clung to every noble child. The household around her reinforced patterns of order and hierarchy. Servants bowed slightly as she passed. Her parents spoke in tones that reminded her of her duty, her place, her role in the great design of England's future. Yet even for someone destined for a short and tragic life, there were moments of softness. A gentle walk in a garden, where roses bloomed in summer air thick with bees. The play of candlelight on painted wood at dusk. The quiet hum of a lullaby from a nursemaid in her earliest years. These fragments of calm and comfort were as much a part of Jane's childhood as the stern lessons and rigid expectations. So this was her world, the rhythms of daily life in Tudor England. A world of contrast, luxury and learning for some, labor and survival for many. A world in which Jane Grey's story would slowly take shape, leading her unwittingly toward the throne of England. And now, with the background of her world gently painted around us, we can turn to her life more directly. Let us walk quietly from the rhythm of the household into the unfolding biography of Lady Jane Grey herself, the girl who became queen at only 6 years old. We return now, from the gentle rhythms of Tudor daily life, to the life of Lady Jane Grey herself. A girl born into expectation, shaped by learning and swept, almost unwillingly, into the currents of power. Lady Jane Grey was born in October of 1537, a year that was itself a hinge in English history. It was the year that King Henry VIII finally welcomed a male heir, Edward, the future Edward VI. The kingdom celebrated, but in a quieter manor house in Leicestershire, another child was welcomed, Jane. She was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon. Frances was the daughter of Mary Tudor, the younger sister of Henry VIII, which gave Jane a link to the royal line. It was a connection that would later become dangerous as much as it was prestigious. From the start, Jane's upbringing was not ordinary. She was not raised to be a quiet noblewoman in the background. Instead, her education was rigorous, even remarkable. She studied Latin and Greek with intensity, later even Hebrew. Tutors described her as precociously intelligent, absorbing knowledge with enthusiasm. Imagine her, still so young, curled over a book with parchment margins thick with notes, the dim light of a winter morning flickering across the page. Her seriousness contrasted with her youth. Later accounts suggested she preferred her books to courtly pleasures, her study to frivolity. One visitor wrote that Jane spoke of her learning with a composure and clarity that surprised even experienced scholars. Her piety, too, was evident. Her devotion to Protestant ideals was strong, reinforced by her tutors and her household. As Jane grew older, her presence began to draw attention. In Tudor England, lineage and faith could not be separated from politics. Her royal blood, through her grandmother Mary Tudor, meant she was always close to the sphere of succession, though at the time, no one imagined she might one day wear the crown. Jane was occasionally present at court, where she met her young cousin, Edward VI. Edward was a frail boy, often sickly, but he too was a devout Protestant and studious by nature. The two shared more in common than with many of their peers: learning, piety, and the weight of expectation. But court life also exposed Jane to pressures she may not have welcomed. Her parents were ambitious. They pressed her into social graces, parades, and displays of loyalty. Accounts suggest she often seemed uncomfortable, preferring solitude and scholarship to the dance of politics and appearances. The true shift came in 1553. Edward VI, still only 15, was dying. His health had long been fragile, but now it was clear he would not survive. With his death, the succession became a perilous question. By law, the crown would pass to his half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a committed Catholic. 4 Protestant nobles who had prospered under Edward, this was alarming. In these anxious hours, Jane's name was drawn into plans. Edward, influenced by his advisors, signed what became known as the Devise for the Succession. In this document, he bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth, naming instead Jane Grey as his heir. She was young, Protestant, and malleable, a figure through whom the powerful Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, hoped to secure influence. It is difficult to know how Jane felt when she learned of this. One account tells of her weeping, protesting that she did not seek the crown, that the responsibility was too great. Imagine her, barely 16, surrounded by powerful men urging her forward, the heavy weight of a kingdom placed suddenly upon her shoulders. That on July 10, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. She was led through the streets of London to the Tower, which at that time was not only a fortress but also the traditional place where monarchs awaited coronation. Trumpets sounded. Heralds declared her rule. Yet the response from the people was muted. There was no great outpouring of joy, no resounding cheer. For many, Mary Tudor was the rightful heir, and loyalty to her ran deep. Jane's reign lasted only 9 days. During this time, she remained largely confined to the Tower, guarded yet isolated, aware of the storm gathering outside. Messages poured in, reports that Mary had rallied supporters, that nobles and commoners alike were flocking to her cause. Even those who had once sworn loyalty to Jane began to waver. The pressure was overwhelming. Within little more than a week, the tide had turned. The council that had placed Jane on the throne abandoned her, declaring instead for Mary. On July 19, 1553, Jane was deposed. Mary rode into London triumphantly, greeted with cheers. Jane, meanwhile, was left behind in the Tower, stripped of the title she had never sought and perhaps never wanted. She was just 16. Imagine her sitting in a quiet chamber within the Tower, its thick walls pressing inward, the noise of guards echoing faintly down stone corridors. Outside, London celebrated Mary's accession with bonfires and bells, but within those walls, Jane's future hung in silence. For a time, there was hope. Mary, though wary of Jane, seemed inclined to mercy. After all, Jane was so young, and it was widely known she had been a pawn in the ambitions of others. She was kept in confinement, but her life appeared spared. Yet, politics would not let her go. The following year, a rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion sought to unseat Mary, and though Jane herself had no hand in it, her family's involvement sealed her fate. In the eyes of the new queen, Jane was too dangerous to be left alive. A Protestant figurehead who could always be raised against her, Jane was sentenced to die. She was only 17. Reports describe her final days in the Tower as marked by quiet dignity. She continued to read scripture, to write letters, to prepare herself with calm faith. On the morning of February 12, 1554, she was led out onto Tower Green. Witnesses wrote that she spoke briefly, acknowledging her faults but affirming her faith. When she turned to the scaffold, she faltered briefly, unable to find the block. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she whispered, until guided by a hand. And then, her short life ended. Lady Jane Grey, crowned queen at 16, gone by 17. A reign of only 9 days, yet her name endures centuries later, remembered both for its brevity and for the sense of innocence swept away by the tide of ambition and power. Her story does not end there, of course. The mystery of her life, her mind, her writings, and the cultural fascination she left behind would continue to ripple across history. And so, as we leave the stark biography of her days, let us move next into the quieter mysteries of her legacy, the writings she left behind, the impressions she gave, and the subtle echoes of a life so short, yet so often revisited. When the gates of the Tower of London closed upon Lady Jane Grey, her reign and her brief moment in power were over. Yet curiously, her presence did not vanish with her life. Instead, across the centuries, she lingered in words, in memory, and in the half-light of cultural fascination. Much of what we know about Jane comes from her own pen. Few young women of her time left behind so many reflections. Her letters, her prayers, and the fragments of testimony that survive offer us a rare window into her thoughts, though those thoughts are always framed by circumstance. Imagine her in her final days, seated in a quiet chamber within the Tower, the candlelight low, the scratch of quill against parchment the only sound. The walls are heavy with silence, and yet she writes with steady composure. To her younger sister, she sent words of encouragement, urging her to hold firmly to Scripture even in times of trial. She spoke with a calm conviction, as though she had already come to peace with her fate. But here lies the mystery that cannot be answered. Was her serenity truly her own? Was it the strength of personal faith, the independence of a gifted mind? Or was it the echo of a lifetime of instruction, the product of tutors and parents who pressed Protestant ideals into her from the very beginning? Her writings suggest a soul at peace, but they also remind us how carefully belief can be shaped by environment. The truest depths of her heart remain unknowable, hidden beyond the veil of history. The Tower of London itself adds to this lingering mystery. It is a place where memory clings to the stone. To walk its courtyards today is to walk among echoes. Jane once moved across those same stones, the rustle of her gown marking her slow steps, the eyes of guards fixed upon her as she passed. Later chroniclers recorded her final walk toward the scaffold, though each record is touched by perspective. Protestant writers portrayed her as a serene martyr, almost saintly in her calmness. Catholic accounts were quieter, less adorned with triumph or sorrow. The truth drifts somewhere between them, blurred by time and the hands of those who chose which details to preserve. Even after her death, Jane's story did not fade. Instead, it was transformed. For Protestants, she became a symbol, a beacon of youthful faith cut short. Sermons and pamphlets held her up as a model of devotion, while portraits painted long after her death softened her features into something angelic, almost otherworldly. During the Victorian Age, fascination with her grew once more. Writers and painters returned to her story, reshaping it into a tale of tragic beauty. On their canvases she kneels in luminous white, serene and pure, framed by candlelight as if awaiting not death but transfiguration. Standing before such a painting in a quiet gallery, one feels the layers of history folding into myth. The young girl, frightened and uncertain, becomes an ideal, less a real person than a symbol of lost innocence. And yet, behind the brushstrokes and the softened narratives, there was a living girl of 17 years, who read, who wrote, who breathed in the cool air of a February morning, and who faced an ending she could not have imagined when her childhood began in the quiet halls of her family's manor. Her story, therefore, remains half-seen. Not entirely fact, not entirely legend. She is a voice through letters, a figure in portraits, a name in sermons, a presence in the stones of the tower. Her legacy lies in that delicate space where history becomes memory and memory becomes culture, where a life, short though it was, continues to ripple outward long after it ended. To understand the story of Lady Jane Grey fully, it is helpful to step back from the solitary figure in the tower and place her once more into the wider world of Tudor England. The social contrasts, the lives of the privileged, and the daily struggles of those far removed from the glitter of power. Jane belonged to the elite, but she was not at the very peak. She was noble, connected to royalty, and raised with tutors and comforts, but her household was not the royal court itself. Within her family's estates, her life carried privileges almost unimaginable to commoners. She wore gowns lined with fine fabrics, read books printed on expensive paper, and ate meals of meats, fruits, and sugar confections that few outside noble circles would ever taste. Around her, a small army of servants ensured that her days ran smoothly. A chambermaid might warm her bed with heated bricks before she lay down, while a groom of the stables readied horses for her family's travels. The rhythm of noble life was one of ritual, refinement, and constant reminders of status. In contrast, the lives of most of England's people were marked by endurance rather than refinement. The average villager lived in a small, smoky cottage, its single room shared by family, animals, and possessions. Their diet was built around bread, ale, and pottage, a stew of grains and vegetables, with meat as an occasional luxury. Each day was guided by the sun, from dawn work in fields to dusk chores at home. While Jane bent over her Latin books in a quiet study, these villagers bent their backs beneath the weight of plows and baskets. The gulf between noble study and common toil was immense, though both were bound together within the same kingdom, under the same changing monarchs. At court, meanwhile, life glittered with ceremony. The elite moved in circles defined by power, ambition, and intrigue. Men and women dressed in silks and velvets, their garments heavy with jewels, their steps echoing across polished floors. Banquets dazzled with music, conversation, and entertainment. Yet behind the spectacle, there was always calculation. Every gesture, every alliance, every glance carried meaning. For a girl like Jane, who valued learning and piety, this glittering environment might have felt uncomfortable, even hollow. And yet it was into this world that she was drawn, where her lineage made her a piece upon the chessboard of succession. The contrast between Jane's short life and the wider span of Tudor society is stark. For most, life was long toil, with small joys carved out of hard labor and community gatherings. For nobles, the struggle was not survival but status, guarding family honor, and navigating the dangerous currents of politics. Jane's fate illustrates this clearly. She had safety, comfort, and privilege in her youth, but privilege placed her in peril. She did not starve or freeze, yet the very family connections that brought her education and opportunity also made her a rival to queens, and thus a threat to those in power. One might imagine her in her last days reflecting, consciously or not, on these differences. Outside the Tower walls, Londoners bustled through markets, buying bread, fish, and cloth, gossiping over ale, or gathering by fires at night. The bells of parish churches tolled as they always had, marking hours of work and prayer. For these ordinary people, queens and kings came and went, yet the rhythm of their lives remained steady. For Jane, however, that rhythm had been broken. She did not live long enough to sink into the background of noble life, to marry quietly, to preside over a household. She was swept upward, briefly crowned, and then cast down. The life she might have had, a noblewoman in relative comfort, was exchanged for a destiny that lasted only 9 days on the throne. The world she left behind continued without her. Mary Tudor ruled, then Elizabeth, and generations of commoners carried on their daily lives with little change to the endless cycle of sowing, harvesting, worship, and survival. Jane's story, though preserved and retold, was but one thread in a much larger tapestry of Tudor England, a tapestry woven from both velvet and homespun wool, from royal proclamations and from the simple creak of a village cart. And so her life reminds us of the contrasts that shaped her world: privilege and hardship, learning and labor, crowns and cottages. Against this backdrop, Jane's brief reign appears as both extraordinary and fragile, a moment when one young life, so unlike the lives of most, intersected with the destiny of a nation. And so, we come to the end of the story of Lady Jane Grey. A girl born into privilege, shaped by study, guided by faith, and caught in a web of ambition too heavy for her young shoulders. At only 16, she was crowned Queen of England, though the title lasted but 9 days. At 17, her life ended within the stone walls of the Tower of London. Her story, brief as it was, has stretched far beyond her years. Letters, portraits, sermons, and paintings have carried her image across centuries, reshaping her into martyr, symbol, and legend. Yet behind all of these layers remains the simple truth of a young life lived in a world both familiar and distant. A world of candlelit studies, of rush-strewn halls, of peasants in fields and nobles in chambers, of crowns that glittered but weighed heavily. As we step back from her story, we can reflect quietly on the contrasts between then and now. Imagine the Tudor night, streets dimly lit by torches, the air tinged with smoke from hearth fires, the sound of bells rolling across a city settling into rest. Against that backdrop, a young queen once waited for a dawn she would not see again. And now, imagine your own night. A world apart, and yet joined in the same rhythm of time. Where once Jane's story unfolded in tension and uncertainty, your own present is steadier, calmer, safer. The crown that cost her life belongs only to history now, and you remain here, in the comfort of the present, where such struggles no longer reach you. Her life was brief, but in its brevity we find a kind of stillness, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting human ambition can be. The weight of power, the noise of court, the glitter of ceremony, all dissolved into silence. What remains are the quieter details, the scratch of her quill across parchment, the cool air of a February morning, the calm faith she carried at the end. And so, as her story fades into the stillness of history, let your own thoughts drift into quiet. The rhythms of Tudor England fall away. The candles gutter and dim. The stones of the tower grow silent. And here, in your own time, you can rest in peace, knowing that the struggles of the past have passed, leaving behind only stories, softened by time, whispered gently into the night. Sleep well, and let history keep its watch while you drift into dreams.